Hello, everyone. My name is Gilda Ross. I'm the director of the GPS Parents Series. I am beyond thrilled when I can welcome Jessica Lahey back to GPS. These are two of her books that should be in the library of every parent's home: The Gift of Failure and Addiction Inoculation. These are two books that are critically important to parents of children of all ages. And I'm especially delighted today because Jordan Esser is here. Jordan Esser is the Assistant Director of Community Initiatives for the DuPage County Health Department, one of our major funders. And I'm so grateful that she's here today to join me. Thank you for the gift of your time. We couldn't do this without you. GPS is about inspiring and informing and empowering parents to meet the challenges of today. And again, we are in for a special treat when it's a Jessica Lahey Day. Quickly before we begin, I want to mention the upcoming programs that you will want to be sure to circle on your calendar. Next week, on Tuesday, we'll be welcoming back Ross Green. His book, The Explosive Child: Understanding Frustrated and Inflexible Children, is also a program you won't want to miss. Share it with someone. Everybody's welcome here. No registration. All programs are free. That's on Thursday, the 30th. He'll be with us at noon and 7 p.m. via Zoom. And then we'll be going into the first week of October, a little bit of a continuation of today. Judson Brewer has a few books he'll be talking about: The Craving Mind and Unwinding Anxiety. October 7th is the day that he will join us on a Tuesday. He'll be with us at noon and 7 p.m. Then we'll go into the next week of October, and we'll be talking about why before where, career planning for the next generation. That's on Thursday, October 9th at noon and 7 p.m. The last program that's coming up, and I know Jessica will want me to stress this important program, 10 to 25, What We Get Wrong, Motivating and Communicating with Young People. Dr. Yeager is a protege of Carol Dweck, has a lot to say about motivating students now. That's on Wednesday, October 15th at noon and 7 p.m. There's also a few programs coming up in Spanish, one for young children, one for adults. So you'll want to go to the website and get all the information. Let's get right into it. Jordan Esser, Assistant Director of Community Initiatives at the DuPage County Health Department. Please take it away. Lots of
Thank you,
watch
Gilda.
parties. Special welcome to all the watch parties today. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Gilda. And I'm very happy and excited to be here and introduce Jessica. I have heard her many times, but I always learn something new. So if this is your first time tuning in, you're in for a treat. If it's your 50th time tuning in, I know you're going to get something out of it today. So Jessica Lahey speaks and writes about the science of motivation, parenting, engagement, and substance abuse prevention, all in service to the belief that adults have the power to help kids become more autonomous, competent, connected, and fulfilled. Her first book, The Gift of Failure: How the Best Parents Learn to Let Go So Their Children Can Succeed, was a New York Times bestseller, encouraging parents to support kids as they learn from their mistakes. Her second book, The Addiction Inoculation: Raising Healthy Kids in a Culture of Dependence, is the culmination of Lahey's experience as an alcoholic with a decade of recovery, the parent of two kids, and 20 years in the classroom, 5 of those years that were spent teaching in an inpatient drug and alcohol rehab for adolescents. Jessica was also awarded the Research Society on Alcohol's Media Award for outstanding journalistic efforts of writers who cover empirical research on alcohol, for her book, The Addiction Inoculation, and for her advocacy for the recovery community. She also hosts the popular #AmWriting podcast from her home in Vermont, and we are very thrilled to welcome her back to the greater GPS community today. Jessica, take it away.
Thank you, Jordan, so much. And Gilda, again, thank you so much for having me back. This is one of my favorite groups to speak with because you have so many incredibly engaged parents. I want to start off with the fact that if you're here watching, if you watch any of these presentations, I want you to think about that the next time you're like, oh my gosh, I stink as a parent. I'm not good enough. I'm not doing enough. The fact that you're here and you want to learn means you are doing great. So thank you so much for being here. We have a ton to cover, and especially want to cover the fact that number one, I'm going to be giving everyone my email address. I'm going to be dropping some links in the chat because number one, there is a bibliography that includes every single book that I am going to refer to here, so that you don't have to write all that stuff down. It's really long and it includes a lot of videos and things like that. If you miss anything, don't worry about it because both Gift of Failure and the Addiction Inoculation, I have done videos on. A friend of mine said, you know, if it's hard to get people to come and listen to an hour on something, why not do 90 seconds on all of the content from Gift of Failure, all of the content of the Addiction Inoculation, plus lots of student questions I get. I have the great privilege to speak in schools and I give all the kids my email address and they email me with all kinds of amazing questions and I make videos about them and I put those up on my website and in the bibliography as well. And they're over in my Instagram and stuff like that. So as someone who's in recovery, I kind of feel like I have the privilege and the duty to make sure that I'm a resource for anyone who wants to talk about that stuff. You know, if you're worried about a friend, if you're worried about your kid, I'm a resource for that. So my email address is teacherlahey@gmail.com. It's also just the entry, the speaking, the little contact me form on my website. All right, let's get started. So I taught middle school and high school for a super long time, and then I also taught in the rehab. And by the time I got to the rehab classroom, I had written The Gift of Failure. I had written a lot of articles. I had a column at the New York Times called The Parent Teacher Conference, where I got to answer all kinds of cool questions from parents and teachers and sort of be the go-between. It was really fun. But by the time I got to the rehab classroom and I saw these kids in my classroom, the youngest kid we had was just turning 13. And then, of course, when they turned 18, they would go up with the adults for the most part. My big question was not just, you know, how, number one, I have two kids who are at a increased genetic risk for substance use disorder, and we will talk about that. But I have these kids in my classroom, and what could we as teachers, as educators, mentors, counselors, you know, school nurses, that sort of thing, what could we have done differently to have made it so these kids didn't need to end up in my rehab classroom? As happy as I was that they were, you know, finally in rehab, I didn't want them to be there in the first place. So the addiction inoculation was, for me anyway, a best practices is what I could do as a parent to prevent substance use disorder in my own kids, given that my kids are at higher risk for a bunch of reasons that I'll talk about. And then what could we have done for these kids? And what do the best school programs look like? I mean, that I went through a terrible one that actually increased my risk for developing substance use rather than decreased it. And that was, I'm 50, how old am I? I'm 55. So it's been a while. They're better now, but there are lots of them that are unproven and the schools just deploy them because they don't know what else to do. So I wanted to make sure that schools had a resource as well for talking about for the programs that they may or may not want to deploy in their schools. Okay. So I talked about genetics, and that's a really good place to start. I'm going to start, first of all, with I'm going to be talking about the science, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about how risk and prevention is like the scales of justice. Okay, so if your risk is really heavy, then your prevention side or your protections are going to have to be heavier in order to zero those things out. So because my two kids were born to me, they automatically have more risk on this risk side because of their genetics. Unfortunately, what we know about the genetics of substance use disorder is that it is about 50 to 60% of the risk picture. And that research comes from Dr. Mark Schuckett in California, at University of California, San Diego. However, it's not a simple picture of like, oh, look, there's that addiction gene and we can just knock that out with CRISPR technology and look, we're saved, it's all over. It's not like that. One of my favorite books actually on genetics and substance use disorder and genetics and kids in general, and especially around personality, is Danielle Dick's book, The Child Code. Danielle works at Rutgers. Her lab specifically is at the intersection of genetics and substance use disorder, and specifically alcohol. And she talks a lot about what we know is genetic and what we know is not genetic. And by the way, what you can do, even if you can't change genetics, what you can do to work with. It's sort of think of it as like a strengths-based approach to genetics, if that makes any sense. So if genetics are about 50 to 60% of the risk, then we have this little thing that I'm not going to go too deeply into, though it's fascinating, called epigenetics. And epigenetics, it's like a cross between nurture and nature. It's about genetics, but what we know about the things we experience, whether that's intergenerational trauma, for example. There's a great article at the New York Times about the trauma from the Dutch hunger winter that went down over multiple generations. There have been studies around this, around the Holocaust, that some people, actually can inherit trauma from previous generations. And that's not because necessarily it's affecting the actual genetic code. It's that it's deciding where things get turned off or don't get turned on or don't get turned on. That's called epigenetics. It's really fascinating stuff. So that's genetics, that's epigenetics. And now we're dealing with the other 40 to 50% of the risk picture. And most of that really comes down to a couple of things. We'll start with the biggie. And the biggie has to do with so-called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. Now, many of you have probably heard of ACEs because of the CDC. The CDC had a big study with Kaiser Permanente, big landmark study. They were actually originally looking for at obesity. They ended up finding out that it seems like there's a list of about 10 things that can happen to you in your early life that can affect your overall health and well-being. And that means your chance of stroke, your chance of mental illness, your chance for substance use disorder, all kinds of outcomes. Those 10 things are a really good starting place for talking about your ACEs, or your adverse childhood experiences. And it turns out the higher your number, between 1 and 10, the higher your risk for developing a bunch of negative outcomes in life. And that list has what you would expect on it, right? Like it has, separation and divorce. It has trauma in the household that includes things like violence, or if a parent is imprisoned, or if you have physical or sexual abuse in the family, that kind of stuff, the things that you would expect in that list. And I know it can be really upsetting to hear about the divorce and separation on that list. And some of the things I'm going to talk about may apply to your family, and it's going to be really, really important for us to think about these risk factors as objectively as possible and not get all heated and upset. Oh my gosh, it's my fault. I got separated and now my kid has high risk. The problem is that when we get too emotional about the risk factors, it can be really hard to objectively think about what preventions we could use to counteract those things. So for example, if you go through a really difficult divorce, there are programs specifically for kids who are going through really challenging divorce, when their family is getting divorced, and those can really counteract the trauma that can go along with that, or getting a therapist, that kind of thing. So we need to be objective about some of these things, like, for example, my kids being born to me, or the fact that one of my kids is queer. That raises her risk of developing substance use disorder as well. And rather than freaking out about it, I try to think about the places where I can shore up the preventions that might help her, so that those risks don't get too overwhelming and tip in the wrong direction. So those CDC risks were out there. And then there's this brilliant woman named Nadine Burke Harris. And she said, well, those risk factors are all well and good. Those adverse childhood experiences are all well and good. But in my practice here in California, I see a lot of other traumatic experiences. And when I talk about traumatic experiences in childhood, what I'm referring to are big S stress, or big T toxic stress, the things that don't just upset us once, but things that are kind of chronic stressors that change the way the body works, that can actually create, for example, some of those epigenetic changes in our bodies. So Nadine Burke Harris published this incredible book called The Deepest Well. This book talks about some of the risk factors, the adverse childhood experiences, excuse me, I keep saying risk factors, in childhood that aren't on that CDC list. Like, for example, systemic racism or adoption is on that list. A lot of the things that our kids may end up going through in their childhood that maybe don't make it to the CDC's list. So understanding those is a really great place to start. And by the way, if you're curious about your own ACEs, Google ACEs quiz. And you can take the quiz out there. I used to work at a rehab, and it was always interesting for people to find out for the first time that the things they went through as kids can have an actual physical impact on their body and can actually contribute to their risk for developing substance use disorder. And I remember seeing this one guy realizing his number was like a 7 or 8 out of 10, and realizing that he was sitting there as a person who'd been struggling with alcohol use disorder for years and years, never understanding why he couldn't control his drinking, and having a moment where he realized, wait a second, some of the stuff I went through in my life is actually related to my alcohol use disorder. This isn't my fault so much. And that lifted a huge burden off of him, and was made it so that he was more receptive to some of the things that he needed to do to get better. And he's doing great, by the way. I actually just saw him recently. Okay, so adverse childhood experiences. And then on top of that, there are a couple of other things that we need to talk about that in childhood can contribute to a higher risk of developing substance use disorder. Some of those things are early aggression between children. If your child is aggressive towards other children, that can raise their risk. And these are such mushy gray categories. There's not like, I can't like give you a percentage of what that does. But as you listen to some of these that I'm going to mention, you can imagine how these things I'm going to talk about can get really tangled up. So the name of the game for all of these, including early childhood aggression, is early intervention. The sooner we're able to deal with the thing that came first, the chicken, or I guess we can't do chicken and egg because we don't know which one came first. Sorry, bad analogy. Okay, so early aggression between children. So if, for example, if your child's teacher says, we're noticing that your kid is hitting other kids, then that's something to take seriously and to think about. And as a fist bump to teachers, know that if your kid's teacher comes to you and says, I'm seeing this at school, then the first response should generally be, oh, that's interesting. That's not a side of my kid I see at home, rather than saying, no, 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 that couldn't be my kid. I've never seen that happen before. That was one of the most common topics I got for the parent-teacher conference, which was, why are we not able to talk to each other? It's a really important part of the parent-teacher partnership. Okay, so early childhood aggression, kids who are failing academically. Now, again, that can also feed into the fact that undiagnosed or undermanaged learning differences can also be a part of that, and they also are a risk factor for developing substance use disorder later in life. We can talk about ADHD specifically if anyone wants to bring that up in the questions, because that's a question I get every single time. So I'm happy to talk about it. A kid asked me about autism spectrum disorder recently too. Happy to talk about that. So aggression, academic failure, social ostracism. Now, again, here's that tangling, right? Because you can imagine that if a kid is hitting other kids, then they're more likely to be ostracized, right, socially. So again, getting back to the tangling and how important it is to get to these things early, so that we can start working on them early. And we're going to be talking about where to look to deal with some of that stuff as well, because there are allies that we need to be talking about. Undiagnosed, as I mentioned, learning issues. In my classroom, in my rehab classroom, pretty much everyone in that rehab classroom had some flavor of a learning difference. Lots of kids with undiagnosed dyslexia who just everyone told them, you know, you're just dumb, you're just not smart, you can't read, that kind of thing. So that sort of stuff all sort of gets piled on that scales of justice, right? That risk side getting higher. you're going to need to deal with that. And again, I guess LGBTQ plus kids have a higher risk of developing substance use disorder. But if you think about some of the ways we can counterbalance this, one of the reasons, for example, that kids with behavioral issues or kids who are on the are LGBTQ plus kids, sometimes that can also mean, especially for the LGBTQ plus kids, mean that they're not getting as much support as they should. So giving more support back to that kid, those kids, is really important. I was at a school recently a while back, and the parents told me their biggest concern was their kids getting stolen away and sex trafficked, right? And as it turns out, in this community, they're actually, the risk of those parents' kids getting stolen away and sex trafficked wasn't, when you look at risk factors, not that high. But what was really interesting is the school where I was speaking, in their school guidelines, in their mission statement, right on their website, said that if you're gay, you can't go to the school, you get kicked out of the school. And so it was interesting to be able to come back and say, look, if you're really worried about sex trafficking, you have to understand that LGBTQ plus kids who get rejected by their family and community are at the very highest risk for being sex trafficked. So it's really important to think about relative risk and how we're dealing with these risk factors. So support, obviously, for many of these things, for learning differences, for all that sort of stuff, is going to come in as an incredibly important counterbalance to the risk that we're talking about. Okay. I also, at this point, want to talk really, really quickly about sleep. This book by Lisa L. Lewis called The Sleep Deprived Teen, one of my favorite books. There's some other great ones too, like Why We Can't Sleep and stuff like that. But this one I just love. One of the things we know about sleep and substance use is that these things work with each other, or affect each other bidirectionally, which means kids who get less sleep tend to use more drugs and alcohol, and kids who use more drugs and alcohol tend to get less sleep. So sleep is so important for so many reasons. But one of those reasons is not just, that it can affect their learning, it can affect their behavior, it can affect so many elements of their health. But tons of parents ask me, how do I know if my kid has a problem with substances? And my answer is always, look for change. And one of the biggest changes you can see is in the change that they're getting in their sleep. And that can be a hint that maybe something's going on with your kid. On the flip side, I also want to, just while I'm talking about negative changes, want to mention, if your kid is not sleeping very much and is suddenly then sleeping a lot, or if your kid is really depressed and then all of a sudden they come home one day and they're super happy all the time, these are changes we need to be thinking about as well. And looking a gift horse in the mouth is something that I would be very liable to do. Yay, I'm so happy my kid is not depressed anymore. But we need to be thinking about change as a warning, a little red flag, to be thinking about what's causing such abrupt change in our kids, right? Okay. So risk factors: genetics, epigenetics, adverse childhood experiences, that list of things that I mentioned. And then there are time periods, which can be of particular risk for kids. A big one tends to be transitional periods. So, divorce and separation, for example, it turns out that the most perilous time for kids is right when that's happening, right as it's happening in the immediate aftermath. Or summers are a transitional period between grades, and especially that summer between middle school and high school, right? That is a particularly perilous time for kids, not only because that tends to fall into the age group of when kids, if they're going to start using, are going to start using, but because that is a really scary transitional time for kids. I remember being petrified during the summer between my safe, small middle school and the big, scary high school. And what was interesting I mentioned that my daughter is queer. My daughter also, we moved during the summer between middle school and high school. Moving is another challenging transition for kids, right? So I happened to be very lucky at this time. I was interviewing some people who have great wisdom, and one of them was Dr. Dan Siegel. So I'm on the phone with Dr. Dan Siegel, and I'm talking to him about interviewing him for the addiction inoculation. And I said, I have to ask you, So my kid, they've got genetic risk from me, and we moved between middle school and high school, and oh my gosh, I'm just piling the risk on my kid. What do I do? And Dan Siegel, in his incredible wisdom, said, Jess, I know that you know about how the adolescent brain works. The adolescent brain, props to Dan Siegel, the adolescent brain is an incredible place. We could talk about the adolescent brain until I keel over sideways from not being able to talk anymore. It is so fascinating. But the adolescent brain craves novelty. And so, Jess, if you want to reframe this and think about this quote unquote risk that you're heaping on your kid, let's reframe it and think about it a little bit differently. How about, especially in front of your kid, you talk about it as being an opportunity. Think of all the new places she can explore and the new people she can meet. And every single time she does that, every time she masters a new bicycle route, or a new way to get to school, or meets a new person, or struggles with something like finding her way to that class in that new big scary high school building, or figuring out how to do her combination on her new locker, which she had never done a combination before. It was really, all this stuff was so scary for her. Every single time she does something new like that, she achieves mastery over it. And what does achieving mastery do? Especially achieving mastery when you know that you've had to rely on yourself and struggle a little bit to figure it out. It releases a wonderful flood of dopamine in your brain. So, one of the most amazing things that we as parents and teachers and mentors can do is understand a little bit more about the adolescent brain, that it is wired for novelty. And the reason it's wired for novelty, the reason, and some people say it's wired for risk. Luther, my dog, is moving in behind me. One of the reasons that people erroneously say that adolescents are just wired for risk is because the purpose of adolescence is to seek out new things and try to master them. So this is very much gift of failure territory, right? So the minute we step in and master it for them, or the minute we step in and take that struggle away from them, or the minute we come in and say, oh, sweetie, I'm so sorry, we've heaped all this risk on you, and this must be so challenging for you. Let me do all of that for you. Let me drive you to school every day so you never have to figure out how to get there yourself. What we're doing are taking away these incredible opportunities, not just for them to become more competent, capable adults, but we're taking away the potential for those hits of dopamine, those hits of mastery, those hits of competence that are going to be so incredibly important to their brains. And we don't have time to go into it, but in the adolescent brain, this need for these dopamine hits, it's strong. And some kids, it's stronger than others. We know those kids who, there's some kids who just needed their adrenaline rush, or some kids who just really feel like they're just bored all the time and nothing is exciting anymore. For those kids in particular, it's going to be really important for us to give them opportunities to get those hits of those essential neurotransmitters through mastery, through competence, through novelty, through new experiences. So sheltering them from those new experiences is taking some of that away from them, which I'm going to segue now into a concept, one of the best preventions we can give kids. So we know about some of the risk factors, and we know we've got to heap more prevention, more protection on there, right? So for me, especially as someone who, I went through recovery when I first got sober when my kids were 9 and 14. So I've been talking to them about alcohol use disorder for even longer than that, because I come from a long line of, our family is just littered with substance use disorder, alcohol use disorder. And so it was really important for me from an early age to be really honest with them about some of the risk factors that they faced. I was talking to someone just recently about her 7-year-old. This woman's sister died from substance use disorder. We didn't get into details, but her 7-year-old, she's been telling her 7-year-old that her aunt died of a disease, and that's fine. At 7, that's the language you can use. use. But as that child gets older, understanding that your family holds this genetic risk for substance use disorder is as important as them knowing that they have a higher risk of diabetes or stroke or a heart attack. This is essential medical information that your kid needs to have. And this is why, by the way, that the most effective substance use prevention programs that we know of, and there's a place that I can tell you about where, and it's in the addiction inoculation, where people can go and look programs up to see how they've been evaluated by an objective third party, not just by themselves, but by an objective third party to find out how their efficacy rates are. That it's really important for us to remember that these kids need not just hopes and, crossed fingers and magical thinking. And, if we just sort of, my kid would never, that kind of stuff. What these kids actually need is real information about their own risk factors. They need to know from a very young age to understand some of the language of substance use disorder. So, for example, as I was mentioning, the school programs that we know of start, I know is going to freak some of you out, in pre-K and kindergarten. And the most effective substance use prevention programs we know of start really young. And no, in kindergarten and first grade, we're not talking about like crystal methamphetamine and heroin. We're talking about things like, why do you think that we spit out the toothpaste after we brush our teeth? Why don't we swallow it? Like, if a little is good in our mouths, wouldn't a lot be better in our tummies? No, because that's a topical thing. And things that are topical for humans go on the outside of our bodies or on the outside of our teeth, but we don't swallow it because it would give us a tummy ache. Or if you see something that looks like candy on the floor, it's really important that you talk to a grown-up before you put that in your mouth, because we have to help you be safe about what you're eating and what you're leaving outside of the body. Or especially in addiction inoculation, I sort of look at what kids are. I do sort of a step-by-step from the time kids are really little until they go off to college, and developmentally where they are and what tools might be the most effective to use in those developmental stages. For little kids who are first learning their letters, if we give them like our prescription bottle and say, can you find the letters of mommy's name, M-A-R-Y? Can you find them on this label? Well, why do you think mommy's name has to be on that label? I mean, if you had the same sickness I have, can't you just take my medicine? Of course not. We never ever take medications that are not prescribed for us. And what's crazy is like 67-ish% of parents in this one particular survey said they knew that if a kid was going to start using prescription medications in a way, misusing prescription medications, that they were probably going to come from a friend's medicine cabinet or their own medicine cabinet. And yet only 10% of those parents were actually talking to their kids about the dangers of taking prescription medications that are not prescribed for you. So those conversations from really little kids, but mostly about things like bodily autonomy and when you feel safe and when you don't like how someone is making you feel, all of these are wrapped up part and parcel of effective substance use prevention programs, mainly because they're part and parcel of social emotional learning programs, which are also where we know the best substance use prevention programs come from. If you want to know what the list is of the currently sort of evaluated by a third party as the most effective programs to be used in schools or in other places, you can go to Blueprints. If you Google University of Colorado and Blueprints, they evaluate all kinds of programs from kids, like that divorce, kids who are experiencing the family's divorce, or substance use prevention programs. All of those are listed there, and they actually look at them, like I said, as objective third parties, and look at their efficacy rates and that sort of thing. It's a really useful resource. It's also on my bibliography as well. Okay. So one of the other things I would hope, if you want to understand a little bit more about your adolescent, because generally speaking, when we're talking about substance use disorder, we're talking about adolescents, or substance use, we're talking about adolescents. So many great books: Dan Siegel's Brainstorm, Frances Jensen's The Teenage Brain, Lawrence Steinberg's Age of Opportunity. There's more here. I just don't have time to mention all of them. The more you understand about the adolescent brain, not only the more you'll understand about why substance use disorder, or substance use, excuse me, during adolescence is just different than substance use at adulthood, the less likely you are to get frustrated with your kid. One of the things that I tell parents is if you're really frustrated with your adolescent not being able to like do the stuff you want them to do, whether that's executive function stuff like remembering their books and keeping their schedule in order and knowing how to open remembering their locker combination, just remember that this part of the brain right here, right between their eyes, that's the last part of the brain to get hooked up. And it's the last part to get wired and to be fully functional. And that's where all the adulting part of the brain is. So let's talk a little bit about that in terms of substance use. So the adolescent brain isn't done developing until the early to mid 20s, right? And it's not like a door slams closed, it sort of creaks closed very slowly, which I'm still hanging on to because my kids are now, 25 and 21. So that door, there's still room for change and growth and stuff like that. But you can breathe a little easier when they get to that early 20s because substance use during adolescence is just a completely different thing than it is after that brain is done being as plastic, meaning it's incredibly susceptible to environmental impacts around it, whether that's the big T trauma, the big S stresses, the chronic stress, that sort of stuff. So things that would be, medium risk in an adult brain can actually be much higher risk in an adolescent brain. Again, don't have time to go into all of the details, but like here's some time, and understanding also that the damage that can be done in the adolescent brain can be short-term damage and like being a little more forgetful or not sleeping as well, that kind of stuff, but it can also lead to longer-term impact because the brain is still developing. And when you short circuit some of the processes, like for example the dopamine cycle or many of the other neurotransmitters, when you're glomming up, for example, some of the receptors in our brain that we need, and some of them we don't even fully understand why we need them. For example, there are endogenous meaning like naturally occurring receptors in our brains for the same stuff that's in cannabis. These receptors, if we're glomming them up with cannabis that we're smoking or vaping or doing whatever, they can't receive the actual naturally occurring cannabinoids that our body makes for some reason that we don't even fully understand yet. And the research on that is still evolving. So understand that when you talk to kids, giving them really good information about that is really important, because one of the things we know about adolescence, it's not, people complain all the time that kids don't seem to be able to understand the consequences of their actions. And that is simply not true. What is true of adolescents is that they weigh the possible positive benefits more heavily, they're more focused on those than they are the possible negative benefits. So any opportunity I have to put some weight on those possible negative benefits, like don't forget you are at an elevated genetic risk for substance use disorder, that's just part of our family. So that might be one weight you could put on there. The fact that, for example, in adolescence, the adolescent brain doesn't process alcohol to this exact same way than an adult brain does. So, for example, an adolescent and an adult who have identically sized bodies and weighted bodies could drink the exact same amount, and the adolescent is going to be a lot less able to understand how impaired they are, and therefore, than the adult, and therefore a lot more likely to take risks and to get behind the wheel of a car. If you know anything about Larry Steinberg's research, you would also know that that's a terrible combination with the fact that in research that Larry Steinberg did, that adolescents, when they're doing an activity, in this case a computer game, that involves judging risk and deciding how much risk to take, that adolescents are likely to take on a lot more risk when they have peers in the room with them watching them take risks, whereas adults don't. So you put alcohol or drugs together with the adolescents' likelihood of taking on more risks when they believe they're being watched by their peers. And by the way, they don't actually have to even be watched by their peers. If the researchers told kids that they were being watched by peers on a closed circuit system, but the kids weren't in the room with them, but they were down the hall watching, those kids playing that risk-oriented game would take on more risk anyway, which explains a lot about how YouTube and Snapchat and some of the craziness that goes on there works, because kids are going to take on more risk if they believe other kids are watching them. It's a terrible little cycle they're going through. Kids who use cannabis more often on a chronic basis during adolescence are more likely to have smaller hippocampuses in their brain. And the hippocampus is the seat of memory formation and consolidation. It is the short-term memory center. You know, I'm aging myself here, but you know, Cheech and Chong, the big joke is like, oh, I can't remember what just happened. Wait, what were we talking about? That's because the receptors for cannabis are right there next to the hippocampus, where we do all of that, like storing short-term memory stuff. So that's one of those reasons that we need to say to kids, look, I just need you to delay. For every year that you delay, you are lowering your kid's lifelong risk of developing substance use disorder. So when the younger a kid is, when they first try drugs and alcohol, the higher their lifelong risk of developing substance use disorder. I used to give numbers, but I'm not crazy about those numbers statistically. I'm married to one and the mother of another person who's heavily schooled in statistics, and we talked about these. I don't think it's easy enough to extricate them from some of the causation and correlation and all that stuff. So here's what I'm going to say about it. If you have, for example, an 8th grader who first tries drugs and alcohol, they have a pretty solid lifelong risk of developing substance use disorder, like even odds, okay? But if they wait 2 years, just 2 years, that risk falls by about half. And if they wait 2 more years after that, that risk falls by about half again. And by the time we get them to 18, their risk for developing substance use disorder during their lifetime falls down to about where it is in the general populace for substance use disorder. So delay, delay, delay. And what can we as parents do? In the last minutes I have, I want to talk about a couple of things that we can do, and I want to bust some myths. It's really important. So what we as parents can do is have, and I know this is going to sound so hard because I know how badly we all want to be cool to our kids. It kills me that I am not cool. I'm never going to be cool. The cat's out of the bag. My kids know I'm not cool. But here's the deal. Parents who have a consistent and clear message of no, not until, you can fill in the blank. You could say not until it's legal for you, but kids, adolescents in particular, they don't like just because answers. Just because answers, because I said so, just because it's legal, that feels really arbitrary. But if you say no, not until your brain is done developing, the closer you can get to that endpoint of your brain being done developing, the less damage we're doing to it up front. What I care about as an educator, and not just in terms of drugs and alcohol, but in general, I want my kids, my students, to get to adulthood with their brains with as much potential as possible, as intact as they can be, so they can become the people that they're meant to be out there in the world. And the last thing I want is for chronic stress, trauma, whatever that thing is, drugs and alcohol, to undermine that before they really get to the place where things are solidified. So parents who have a consistent and clear message of no, not until it's legal, not until your brain is done developing, preferably, have kids with much lower levels of substance use. They just do. Parents who have a permissive take on drugs and alcohol, and this includes, I'm so sorry to say, sips at home. Oh, we're just going to have a party here at the house so the kids are safe. We'll take everybody's keys. That way everyone will be safe. It sounds like harm reduction. It does. And that whole, well, they're going to do it anyway. Well, I might as well just let them. All of that permissiveness around drugs and alcohol, what that does is it results in kids with much higher levels of substance use disorder. Now, keeping in mind that peer group is a big factor in whether or not your kid is going to use, it is true that if their peer group uses, your kid is more likely to use. Although I really test that theory in the chapter on peer group in the book, The Addiction Inoculation. I'm really messed around with that a little bit. I poked at it a lot to find the holes in that. However, if you're having a party and you say you can have your friends over, we'll take away everybody's keys so everyone is safer, not only is that against the law, number two, you're not just raising your kids' risk of developing substance use disorder and of using substances early and messing with their brains, you're also raising your kids' peer groups risk of developing substance use disorder. And again, I'll repeat it just for fun, it's illegal. So there are a lot of reasons to have a consistent, clear message of no, not until your brain is done developing. I do want to bust one myth, and I know what the emails are going to say. I already know what they're going to say. The myth of the moderate European drinker. I love this myth. I loved this romantic ideal so much. So when and I admit to it in the addiction inoculation, that if I give my kids sips, then my kid can learn how to be a moderate drinker. They won't freak out when they go to their first keg party. They won't flip out and drink all of it because this is the one chance they get. So if I teach them, if I model moderation for them here at home and give them little sips, then I can teach my kid how to drink like a moderate drinker and not freak out. Well, there's a couple of problems with that. You can model moderation for me 24/7, and I'm never going to be able to learn moderation because once I've had my first drink, I'm off to the races and I'm going to drink all of it. Number two, if you look at the World Health Organization's list of, if you look at the World Health Organization Europe's information on alcohol use around the world, the European region as a whole has the highest rates of disease attributable to alcohol use and death attributable to alcohol use. 7 out of 10 of the top alcohol consuming countries in the world are all in the European region. Yes, there are exceptions, but here's the cool thing. The exception proves one really important thing for us. The countries that are exceptions to that rule are countries where there is a sort of a societal prohibition against being falling over drunk in public. That yes, you might drink with meals, but it's just not cool to be falling over drunk in the streets. Those countries not only have lower levels of substance use disorder, they also have lower levels of just drinking, lower levels of disease attributable to alcohol, and death attributable to alcohol, which kind of proves a point that I would love to put out there, that no, it is not inevitable that kids are going to drink. It's just not. And if anything, over the past decade, longer than a decade now, actually about 15 years, we have seen a really nice steady decline of alcohol use, in particular among kids, and among other things as well, continuing to decline. But we can create a culture around drinking in our community, in our home, in our school, here among all of us at GPS. I mean, that if we are supporting each other in a community of no, not until your brain is done developing, your brain is too important to mess with. And adolescent use is not the same thing as adult use. And once you become an adult, go at it. You can do what you want. But given the information that we have about the way the brain develops and the impact that drugs and alcohol have on the adolescent brain, in this family, we say no, not until it's legal for you, which can, lead to some weirdnesses. We had a kid here visiting us. I live right near where my kids go to college or did go to college. So we take people in over the holidays, and we had a kid here who was from a country where the legal drinking age is 18. And that kid was over 18, but no, not in our house. Not in the legal drinking age here is 21, but that's a proxy for no, not till your brain's done developing. That's just how it is in our house. My daughter rolled her eyes, but she totally understood. That's just the way it is in our household. And she understands why, which is the most important part of this. Help your kid understand why. Because their brains are still developing, because your family has a higher risk of developing substance use disorder, because they're less able to understand how intoxicated they are when they drink alcohol. And there's all sorts of other details I would love to be able to discuss, but we're running out of time, and I want to make sure that we can get to the questions that come up. There's some really lovely questions, comments in here about, the ADHD stuff. ADHD, what we know about ADHD and the risk for developing substance use disorder is this. Let's start at the beginning. So, one of the things we know about, I hate the term self-medicating because it's not really what it is. But what we know about kids who have neurodivergence is that their brains can be very loud, or their brains can be hyper, they can be liable to just overreact to stimulus, that kind of thing. So what some kids will turn to, and in the addiction inoculation, I talk specifically about a girl, her name was Georgia. And in middle school, she had such debilitating anxiety that when she heard from an alcohol an alcohol prevention program that alcohol can numb things and make you not feel stuff, she was like, ding, 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 ding. And she started drinking. And by the time I met her at 15, she was a daily drinker. The water bottle in our classroom that was on the floor next to her desk did not have water in it. She was doing the best she could based on the fact that she had these overwhelming symptoms of anxiety or of not being able to focus. So for a kid who can't focus, for a kid whose brain is really, really loud, boy, cannabis can really quiet things down. Or boy, taking speed because of its paradoxical, because of the way speed works in kids, can really quiet the brain down. So it is true that among kids with ADHD, that that substance use disorder in kids who are not well managed in their ADHD, whether that's therapeutically, whether that's medicinally, pharmacologically, those kids do have higher rates of developing substance use disorder. When kids are managed well, either through medications or through therapy, their rates go back down. So that's excellent. Similar with autism spectrum disorder, there are higher rates there for substance use as well. So there is a book I have here. Oh, I like aspects of. There's no one book that I can pick up and say I love everything about this book, but Gabor Mate's book, Scattered Minds, about ADHD. He also happens to be the guy who wrote, among the in the realm of the Hungry Ghosts, about addiction and substance use disorder on the streets of Vancouver. But this book, Scattered Minds, has some aspects of it. But the resources that I love are on my bibliography. The online resources that I love the most are on my bibliography, which is listed again back up in the comment section. And I'm going to drop the link to all of the videos that are on my website. Oops, I need to put this to everyone. Sorry. So there are probably 300 videos on my website and in my Instagram reels on everything I talked about with substance use and substance use disorder and gift of failure topics and question kids have asked me. Kids ask me about caffeine. They ask me about sleep. They ask me about 7-OH and fentanyl and all the risky things that they're scared about. They talk to me about those, which is great. And they're all there as videos as well.
Your
How do
wisdom,
we do, Gilda?
fabulous as always. I mean, you had mentioned that you were going to kind of talk about both of your amazing books. And I put lots of stars when you talk. And before we started, we talked about how sometimes you have to hear something several times. And I think when it comes to doing for your children what they can do for themselves, it's a message you need to hear again and again. And the way that you talked about the fact that we're denying them
Yeah.
when that need for the dopamine that really resonated with me a lot.
There's a term self-efficacy, which is one of my favorite things to talk about. Self-efficacy is the belief that if you don't like the way something's happening in your life or in the world, that if you take action, you can affect change. That it's also Shane Lopez, the late great Shane Lopez, that's also one of his definitions for hope. But self-efficacy is so important. In fact, when we were looking about where to excerpt parts of the addiction inoculation, I knew I wanted the New York Times piece to be about self-efficacy because I truly believe giving kids a sense of self-efficacy is one of the most important things we can do, because what it's doing is giving kids back their own internal locus of control. And when kids feel like they have some control over what's going on around them, not only does their anxiety go down, but their sense of self-efficacy goes up. And you end up in a situation where kids are a lot more able to, if you read, for example, Michelle Borba's Thrivers, she talks a lot about ways to give kids back some control. Bill Stixrud and Ned Johnson's The Self-Driven Child, another wonderful book. But I cannot leave without recommending that everyone asks, is there something I can hand to my kids? A book I could hand to my kids? And I'm going to say yes, but with a caveat. You buy this book, but then do not get your parents' stink all over this book and say, oh, sweetie, I would really love it if you would read this book. Buy this book and put it somewhere in your house. See all the bright colors? This is Nick and David Sheff's book, High. It is, even the really cynical kids in my drug and alcohol rehab classroom, they liked this book. And if they liked this book, and they're pretty sure they know way more than anyone else about drugs and alcohol, if they liked this book and they signed off on it, then I think most kids will find that at the very least, it's informative. It does not talk down to kids, which is the first big hurdle a lot of books for adolescents don't get over.
You mentioned Bill Stixrud and Ned Johnson are coming November 5th about their book, The Self-Directed Child, back again.
And their other book is where they have two books that are just great. And there's actually The Self-Driven Child actually now has a workbook.
That's the one they'll be talking about, the workbook.
Yeah, there's a workbook for this, and it's great, and it's behind me somewhere behind that stinky and dirty poster.
Good, good. So, you know, in talking about, you mentioned their other book about how do I say it, the communication. So what do we, you know, I think, you know, you've given us so much information. Now we can't wait to like have that conversation, and we're going to be passionate, and and we don't want to be heavy-handed. So give me some talking points about having that conversation other than take a breath. So what should I do?
Yeah. So the first truism is that, and Peggy Orenstein, who wrote Boys and Sex and Girls and Sex, says the same thing. Oogie conversations that make you cringe, only get easier the more often you have them, right? So my kids expect that at some point or another, we're going to be talking about drugs and alcohol again, because that's what we do, right? So that's a really important part of it. It's just making these regular conversations that you have. If they're so uncomfortable that it's unbearable for you, think about going for a walk with your kid. When you're standing next to each other and not looking right in each other's eyes, it can be a lot less scary to have those conversations. And this is something that a friend of mine, Jennifer Hartstein, who's a therapist for adolescents, she talks about a lot, that in her office, if a teenager is so uncomfortable that she can't talk to Jen's like, fine, text me what you want to say. If it's so hard to say it, then text it. Find a way in. Sometimes that can be by talking about someone else. And when I mentioned in the addiction inoculation in the peers chapter, I was scared to death because my son Ben was friends with this kid, Brian. And Brian got kicked out of high school, not once, not twice, but 3 times. And the third time, you know, they really wanted to go and support their friend and go see him at rehab and all that stuff. And it scared me to death because I know what I know about peer groups. But it opened the door for me to say, I am so proud of you for supporting Brian and sticking with him while he's going through this really hard time. But you need to understand that for me as a parent, I know that the more of your friends use drugs and alcohol, the more likely you are going to be to use drugs and alcohol. So therefore, we're going to be talking about this a lot. And that opened the door for my son, Ben, to use Brian as a way, you know, that whole my friend, blah, 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 blah. He could ask me all kinds of questions that maybe he wasn't comfortable asking me in the first place. So having a way into that conversation, it could be about someone else. It could be about a movie that you saw. It could be about a book that you read. It could be about, you know, Nick Sheff almost died from he was addicted to crystal methamphetamine and cannabis and a bunch of other things. And he's doing great now. So how does someone come out the other side of that? It could be about a relative that you're worried about. There's so many great ways to open this conversation. It could even start with, you know, why do you think grandma makes Uncle Ted go outside to smoke his cigarette or vape his vape? Those are the kind of conversations that you can open up as kids are seeing. And marketing, advertisements. Sweetie, this is one of my favorite things to do. If you hadn't noticed, adolescents hate being manipulated. So, talking about the way the media manipulates kids in order to sell them things is a great way to talk about it. Sweetie, what do you think they're trying to sell you in this ad? Are they trying to sell you beer, or are they trying to sell you the delusion that if you drink this beer, that you will be attractive and have lots of friends and hang out, on the beach with 26 of your friends having a great time? That's the sort of thing that we just have to find a way in that works for our kids. And unfortunately, well, fortunately for us, that means we kind of have to know what our kid is thinking about and interested in. And so any communication about this starts with communication about the easy stuff, the small things and the things that they're interested in. Kids tell me over and over and over again, don't tell my parents this, but I actually do want to be able to talk to my parents. I just don't want to talk to them about the stuff that they want to talk about all the time. I want to talk about some of the stuff that's important to me, and I feel like they don't listen sometimes. So if you want to get to this hard stuff, you got to start with the easy stuff and knowing what your kids want to talk about that's important to them.
You're making me think about be curious. Two
Yeah.
ears and one
Yeah.
mouth for a reason.
Yeah.
So you talked about the decrease in alcoholism. Is that in any way related to more vaping, more marijuana use?
Okay, so what we know is that kids, unfortunately, the way that we do the surveys, like the risk surveys, it goes up to 18, and then it's really hard to capture the information on like that little group from 18 to 25 that really is still part of that young adult adolescent group. So what we know is that from up to 18, alcohol use, all the use has gone down. During COVID, there was right before COVID, there was a bit of a plateau, but it has continued to go in a downward trajectory. However, 18 to 20, 19 to 25, we have seen a rise in off and on psychedelic use, cannabis use, that kind of thing. What's been really fascinating are the studies that have come out to show that in the states where legalization has happened, I don't know. I know these are from sources that I can really trust, and I've looked at them really carefully, and maybe we can get Jordan in here on this, but the studies are showing that there hasn't been a real increase in cannabis use in kids under the age of 18, even where legalization has happened. So, I'm going to keep one little skeptical finger over there and just keep looking. But that's at least what the risk studies have been showing.
Jordan, did you have a question you wanted to ask as we're getting ready to say goodbye?
I do have a question.
Mhm.
I'm wondering, well, now I have another question. Send me those studies because I'm interested in seeing that.
It was like 9 months ago. I'll send it to you.
Okay, yeah, I'd love that. So I could talk to you all day. I could listen to you all day. I'll give you just a quick when I heard you years ago about talking to kids at a young age with poison control type
Mhm.
topics, knowing
Mhm.
that they're going to make those connections. I did that with my daughter, and weeks went by, and she saw a bright pink Benadryl, and she was probably 3, comes to me and says, I found this on the floor. I'm not putting it in my mouth because we talked about
Oh,
it. I was like, oh
yay.
my God, it worked. So my question is a little twofold. So I have a 2-year-old son, almost 2-year-old son, and a
Mhm.
5-year-old daughter. My daughter is just starting kindergarten. She's about a
Mhm.
month in. In my mind, in my line of work, I'm excited for her, but I'm also just holding my breath.
Mhm.
I'm going to do everything I can and just hope she makes it through. But my question is, are there one or two tips you have for parents
Mhm.
at with kids of that age to
Mhm.
help set the stage for prevention in these conversations? And to give you a quick example, I think I'm annoying her already because I tried to give her a break right after school, but then eventually I'm like, who did you sit next to?
Yeah.
Who did you play with?
Yeah.
Like, just so I know, are you okay? Or how's the transition? And she's already like, why do I have to tell you everything? So I'm
Page,
like, you don't,
so
but I'm here.
page 158, 159 specifically is I do scripts for like every
Good.
single thing.
Oh,
So all
nice.
the way from kindergarten all the way through to when they're going off to college. And there's, by the way, I know this is a while off for you, but there is a whole chapter in here on college, which I thought, why should I do that? Everyone drinks in college. That's not true either. It turns out that that's just one of those sort of media created illusions that we have about college. And it's actually pretty predictable who will and who won't. But there are scripts throughout the whole book. And I want to put in a plug for the part of the book that technically I didn't come up with, which is there's 2.5 pages of, I asked adolescents to tell me about the excuses they would come up with if they were at a party and they didn't want to use, drink, whatever, and didn't want to lose face, while understanding, of course, that no is a complete sentence. And they gave me 2.5 pages of some of the coolest excuses that they could use, that they felt safe using in a situation where they didn't feel like using, drinking, whatever, that make perfect sense. And actually, most of them are evidence-based, that sort of gave them an out if they wanted one and felt like they just couldn't say no and leave it at no.
Thank you.
Just ask them. They're amazing human beings and they will tell you things, but they have to know that you're actually interested in them and not lecturing to them, but talking to them without judgment, without freaking out emotionally, but talking to them and listening and listening and listening and listening.
So much passion, so much wisdom
I
in
love
1
them.
hour that will definitely be available afterwards for anyone who wants to check it out on the GPS YouTube channel, thanks to the generosity of this wonderful woman, Jessica Lahey.
Gilda, can I mention my email address one more time in case anyone
Please.
needs it? teacherlahey@gmail.com. And it's just, if you go to the contact form on my website, it's just that. You can ask me about any questions on any of this stuff. If you want me to come to your school, we can talk about that. Just email me and I will answer any question you want to ask about this stuff.
I thank all of you for this gift of your time to be here. You have spent 60 minutes plus learning from one of the best and how fortunate we are. So call someone, tell someone. This will be available afterwards. So much wisdom here. Thank you, Jessica. Always a tremendous pleasure. Thank you, Jordan, for
Thank
your
you so
support.
much.
Thanks, everyone. Go hug the kids.